something that will kill you. Right? And they showed reenactments of how these normal things will kill you. All right, so that's basically how it worked. Like, well, little children think they're safe on escalators. Think again. And it shows some boy getting like his arm sucked down in the escalator, and so you don't ride escalators anymore. Or like, you think your house's heating system is safe. Well, watch how it killed 9 people, who were just taking a nap because of carbon monoxide or something. Or tornadoes, or I remember I watched one episode where a woman was gardening and there was like an underground bee's nest and it like went crazy. And so then when I went to my grandma's garden, I thought every little lump was a bee's nest in the ground. I wouldn't touch the dirt because I knew that just millions of bees would kill me because William Shatner told me so. Right, so I was scared of everything. I was scared of carbon monoxide. I would always make sure my mom had checked the batteries on the carbon monoxide detectors even before I was tall enough to reach them myself. We had fire safety things. I was terrified of tornadoes, terrified of the dirt. You get the picture. And then robberies, man. I would stay up all night worrying about it. I lived in I don't know if they've judged this, but if they did, my town would be judged the safest town in the United States of America, probably. Gold Grove, Ohio. Well, before prescription drug abuse became a real big thing. But prior to that, it was pretty safe. But I knew someone was going to break into our house every single night unless I stayed awake to check. I just had to check. So I was a really scared kid, and I would say most of it is about this. But I had a lot of worries, a lot of anxiety, and that's traced with me to this day. So Jesus gives us this really cool passage about worry and what to do if you are a worrier. So I just want you to know that if you do consider yourself a worrier, I connect with you on that point. I am a worrier too. I'm a real big worrier. I'm recovering in some aspects, but it's still a whole thing. So a really cool thing about this teaching is that it's pretty logical. If you actually map it out, like the ideas, and the theme, Jesus basically gives like a thesis statement and then some supporting arguments and then a nice conclusion. It's like a good 3x5 essay, if you remember those for Ohio graduation tests. So that was good. I was the first year to ever take the OGT, by the way. If you're an Ohio resident, you know what that means. Yep, so passed. What up? I guess we all did, though. Not a big deal. It seemed like it. So, anyways, all right. I thought about telling an OGT story, but that would totally detract away from the point, so we're going to focus. Here we go. All right, so what I'm going to do is I don't have an outline for you. I'm sorry. I got it in late. But if you want to take notes on the back of your bulletin, you're more than welcome to, and I'll try to clearly explain where the points are. Okay. So we're going to walk through the points from this passage, and I'll probably read through it a couple times here or there. But the very first thing we know, and this is kind of the overall idea, and if you want to call this a point one, you can, is Jesus tells us, don't worry about your needs. Don't worry about your needs. The very first verse, again, 25, says, therefore I say to you, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. Isn't life more than food and the body more than clothing? Later on he says, why would you worry? Who among you by worrying can add this? Don't worry about this. Another one down here, don't worry, so I tell you, do not worry. There's just a lot of don't worry. Just don't worry. Be happy. That's kind of a lot of don't worry. So I want to kind of tear this apart and think about a little bit about worry and what it means. A really cool thing is the very first word of this teaching is, what's the word? Therefore. Okay, now that's everybody knows it, but that's a big word. You shouldn't just skip over therefores because, all right, let's say it. If there's a therefore, somebody fill in. What are you supposed to do? What's it there for? What? Yeah, so that's supposed to be a cheesy thing to remind you. If you grew up in church, then there's just a lot of cheesy sayings, justified is just as if I'd never sinned, for example. Yep, if you haven't heard that one, you're welcome. Put that in your pocket. Put it in your pocket. But this one is therefore. If you ever see a therefore in the Bible, you're supposed to think, what's that there for? With a space in between the there and the for, just in case you weren't sure. So it's always pointing back to something. Okay, if you were here last week, Chris talked to us about this passage where Jesus talks about not storing up treasure in heaven, or not storing up treasure on earth, but rather storing up treasure in heaven. And this kind of was a message that was aimed a little bit towards those people who maybe had some wealth, or maybe had some extra possessions, and they were trying to store up for themselves. And he talked about, a man who stored up a bunch of things in his barn, and he thought, I'm going to be safe for a long time, and then, Jesus talked about how basically his life was going to be taken from him that night. What's all this stuff going to do for him? So we talked a little bit about wealth and money, and Chris gave a really cool talk about what it means to store up treasure in heaven instead of earth, and that It looks like, investing in people and making Jesus our treasure, and some really cool things. But this passage is actually directly tied to that passage. They're very, very identical. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. Because the last thing he said to us, and that we just read, was basically that no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be loyal to one and have contempt for the other. You cannot serve both God and wealth, or you might say God and mammon, which is just a word for possessions and stuff. You can't serve both God and stuff. And so I think if I were like in this time, if I were a poor person, let's say I was a person who the thought of having things to save up, and like having possessions that you could save was just a foreign concept to me. I didn't even know if I was going to have food the next day, And I were listening to Jesus talk to these people saying, hey, store up your treasure in heaven. And we looked about how that means giving money as well to the poor. Don't store up, you may not have that. If I were a poor person, I'd be like, preach it, Jesus. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I don't have any money. These people think they can store it. Like, they should be given away. Like, preach. That's what I would be thinking. But then he turns on it. And now this message is a little bit more geared towards those people who may not have anything to store up at all. In fact, they may be people who are worrying that they may not have food on their table at all. And so that's something that's kind of cool to look at, is that it's easy for, he oftentimes in these teachings casts wide nets. So that, he equates it, we make these divides between certain people, rich and poor. But a lot of times in his teachings, he shows that your problem and your problem, it's really the same darn problem. You call it different things, but it's really the same. And so this is kind of the same exact message, but just spoken to those who may not have anything to store up at all. So the worries he talks about specifically are worrying about food, about water or drink, and worrying about clothing, and having something to wear, and maybe something appropriate to wear at least. So those are kind of the worries he's addressing. Now, a lot of us as college students, and specifically college students in the United States of America, have a lot of those things taken care of for us. But the concept of worry and the general truths he gives, I think, kind of transcends just worrying about material possessions. However, I know that a lot of college students, unaware to us, do have worries about whether they're going to have food on the table or not. So I don't want to assume that doesn't relate to some of us here. And I think the worry passage will connect to that as well. Okay, so he says, don't worry. Therefore, do not worry about what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. So one thing that we can see from this passage about why we shouldn't worry, this is kind of a sub-point for one, is that worry is counterproductive, for one. This is kind of, I think, something that is common sense, but he says that later on. He says, who among you by worrying can add a single moment to your life? I think it's literally a single cubit to your life, but it's basically like a day or a measurement. How many of you can, by worrying, will add a single unit of measurement to your life? And that's an interesting point, because we do know now that worry and stress often have a really negative effect on your health and your life. I can attest to that with two hands. I can't actually raise them both because I got the mic, but I would put them both in the air if I had the wireless working. Two hands in the air, that worry and stress and anxiety is actually pretty bad for your health, your physical health. It probably takes away days from your life, doesn't add them. So it's counterproductive. It never helps to worry. Sometimes in stress you can have like a fight or flight, and sometimes it's helpful, but it's the long-term worry about whether things are going to be taken care of, certain needs, if you're going to get what you want, if you're going to get the future that you think you need, or get into the thing you think you want to get into. That kind of worry, that's never going to help. It's counterproductive. And then something that is not necessarily spoken straightforward in this passage, but if we connect it, which Jesus does with the therefore, connected to the last passage, we can see too that worry is self-focused. And so worry is always going to be kind of focused on yourself. You're going to be inherently selfish when you're worried about things. And it may not seem like selfishness up front, but when you're worried, you're thinking, your mind is on you. I can attest to this. Whenever I am dealing with anxiety, I'm not thinking about the good of other people or their situations. Even if I am worried about someone else, it's still kind of a selfish control issue. And you may disagree, but think about it. But I'd say that worry is kind of self-centered, and I think it can masquerade as responsibility, and it can masquerade as I'm just a hard worker and I just care a lot, about my work, or I care a lot about this, or I'm just concerned and I'm responsible. That's why I worry. But I think that that's kind of false, because I still think that that you can be a hard worker for someone else's benefit. You can be a hard worker for good things. We're going to talk later on about this concept between effort and worry. But at the same time, I think a lot of the times, worry is not actually work. And you're not actually helping. It's not serving anybody. It's not helping you or anyone else. So it's really just self-focused and unproductive. That's what worry is. So we shouldn't do it. All right. So luckily, though, that's not just the only part of Jesus' teachings. Because if you're a worrier, okay, how many of you that identify as a worrier know you knew that already? That worry's not so great. You would like to not worry. Okay, great. If I just told you, all right, stop it. Let's go home. Let's sing a couple songs and go home. Then nobody's gonna really take much from that. Because that's just the way some of these psychological things are. You know that you shouldn't, and you even when it's happening, I worry and I think, geez, I wish I could stop worrying about this. I wish I could just stop. But you can't tell yourself to just stop and then you stop. You can't be like, oh yeah, this is unproductive and self-focused. I think I'll stop. Maybe it works. But the really point of this argument is just to know, like, you should want to not worry. Worry is bad, and worry is bad for you, and it's bad for other people. So we'll go on now to talk about how do we stop those. It's easy at this point. It's like, well, easier said than done. Jesus, thank you very much. Thanks for the do not worry command, but that's not like do not steal. Like don't steal. Okay, I won't do that. But do not worry is like it's just something that swells up within you. And it seems hard to stop. And I think sometimes the more you focus on not doing it, the more you do it. It's crazy. Okay, but he gives us some really cool connecting points, some pieces of advice. So he goes on kind of to tell us how we can not worry. And that's what we're going to focus on going on. So there's just kind of a point. This is point 2, and it has an A and a B. All right. So this is what should we know to not worry? All right. So point A is that God cares for you. God cares for you. But we can look at this in the passage too, starting in verse 26. He says, "Look at the birds in the sky. They don't sow seed or harvest grain or gather crops into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Now aren't you worth much more than they are?" And later on, in verse 28, it says, "Notice how the lilies in the field grow. They don't wear themselves out with work, and they don't spin cloth. But I say to you that even Solomon in all his splendor wasn't dressed like one of these. If God dresses the grass in the field so beautifully, even though it's alive today and tomorrow it's thrown into the furnace, won't God do much more for you, you people of weak faith?" So he connects it to the birds and to the flowers. He says, hey, the birds they don't go gathering around, but God really takes care of them. And doesn't he care much more about you than birds? And then the lilies of the field, he says the same thing. The grass, he dresses it really beautifully. Even Solomon, the rich, really, 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 really rich king, wasn't dressed as nicely as he was. But the grass is. So doesn't God care about you? And so I think this is a really cool point. I don't want to really skip over this too much. Is that he ties it to basically the worth that we have. That there's worth, that we have worth to God. We're inherently worthy, meaning we have worth to God. And in this passage, he says we're worth more than birds and flowers. Well, that doesn't make me feel too great, though. I like birds a lot. Flowers are pretty, but I hope I'm worth more than that. But when we think about how much we're worth to God, I think we can take this message a lot further than that. I want to talk about 2 concepts. I kind of want to, in grad school we call this problematizing. So I'm going to problematize a word right now, all right? Which just means I'm going to mess with it a little bit, okay? So I want to talk about the word worthy for a second. I specifically want to compare the word worthy with deserving. Now, we talk about humans and Christians and sinners specifically as being unworthy of God, right? And that's, I think, even in a worship song, like, I'm so unworthy. You know that one? Yeah, I'm not going to get on a solo up here. Calm down, people. I don't do this stuff. But I'm glad people do. It's not me, and you should be glad I don't either. But when we think about worthy being not so much separate from deserving. So deserving means that I've earned something, right? I deserve it because I've earned it. But worthy is not so much about what you do, but about just an inherent quality of who you are. Now, what I'd like to say is that if that's the word for worthy, because I think in that worship song where we say, I'm so unworthy, but still you love me, I think what we really mean in that song is, I'm not deserving. I'm so undeserving, but you still love me. But the thing is, I'd like to argue, and you can argue with me later, but I got the microphone right now, so you can't do it now, but you can later, that I think we are worthy of God's affection. And why I say that is because He says it. So God, He's God, so He determines what's worthy and what's not. He determines value, right? So worthy and value, that's like the same thing. So God basically, what we know from the rest of the story is that Jesus wasn't just a great teacher, right? He was. I mean, I hope your minds have been as blown by the teaching that we've talked about so far as mine has. Realizing that, man, if we just lived by this teaching, if the people of this good green earth lived by these teachings, we would have a really great place. We'd really have a great place going for us. But Jesus isn't just a teacher. He's not just a great teacher. He came and died as a sacrifice for us, right? So He's God come to earth, and He says that He loves us. God wants to be with us. And Jesus, it talks about Him being this means of reconciling us to God, that we have this broken relationship with God. And Jesus came to give His life for that, to take all the junk that separated us from God, all our transgressions against God, and He bore them Himself on the cross so that we could be united with God. God found us worthy enough to send His Son to die for us. Not deserving, not that we've earned it, but where we are worthy strictly because of the love that God puts on us. Not because of anything we've done or any kind of special thing about our actions, but because God deems us worth dying for, then we are. And I want to just really make sure we keep that separate from deserving, because we are not deserving, but we are worthy because He loves us. Does that make sense? So I think a lot of times, like, those concepts can get mixed up. As Christians, we should have a pretty awesome view of people, of ourselves and of other people, because God values us. He made us. He created us. He found us worth dying for. So we really should have a really pretty loving view of ourselves and a pretty loving view of other people. Even people who aren't believers or who are even hostile towards believers, God still found them. Like he went after them. He said, I love you enough, I value you enough, that I'm going to lay down my life that you might be reconnected with me. But we're not by any means deserving that we've earned that and we've worked our way towards that relationship. So the first point we have to make is that God really cares for you. That you really have, God puts a lot of worth in you. Okay? He likes the birds, He made them. They do their thing, He likes all the animals, I guess. Sea otters and the kittens and everything. And He likes the flowers, So Valentine's Day, some of you people might have gotten flowers out there. He really likes those, But He really, really, really values you. He puts a lot of worth in you. And He loves you a lot. And so that's the first point. And before we kind of go to point B, you just have to really understand that. And if God cares for us this much, cares enough for us, not just cares for us more than the birds that He made or the flowers that He made, He cares enough for us to send His Son to give His life for us. Cares enough for us for that much. Then the point B is that we should trust that God will provide for us. Because He really cares about us. So we should really trust that He will provide for us. And worry in this sense it always indicates, whenever you worry, and I think this is a completely exclusive statement, true in all situations. You can talk to me later if it's not. But worry always indicates a lack of trust in God in some feature. I'm not saying that to shame you, because remember, I am like Captain Worry. But worry always indicates a lack of trust in God. Now, 2 disclaimers to make about this trusting God part. Okay, so don't worry. God really cares for you, so trust that He'll provide for you. 2 disclaimers. One is that this trust, it has to be tied to knowing that He cares for you. You have to tie that to that. If you don't really have a full concept of how much God cares for you, how much He loves you, how far He went to show that to you, all the way to the cross. If you don't have your self-image and value in that understanding, if you don't have your identity rooted in the fact that He gave His life for you, then it's going to be really hard to trust him with really big things. Mm-hmm. But if your identity is right there, right there in that cross, then that second point will, I think, flow a little bit more naturally. That he's going to provide for your needs. Right? He laid his life down for you. I think he'll probably put food on your table. He'll probably take care of your future. He'll probably put you with the person you're supposed to be with. He'll probably take care of those things. He died for you. This is small stuff. But it has to be rooted to that. Disclaimer 2, and hear me out on this, because we're hearing like these passages are like, hey, the birds don't work. They don't store up. The flowers don't spin. So understand that when he says don't worry, trust that God will provide for you, trust is not a substitute for effort. Trust is not a substitute for effort. It's not a substitute for work. The birds work. I assure you they do. I'm from southeastern Ohio. I've seen a little nature in my day. They build nests. I've seen it. All right? They get the twigs and they pick stuff out. I saw that on the Discovery Channel. They work. All right? The flowers, they do that photosynthesis stuff. They get work done. All right? They're not lazy. They're not just laying around. Look how pretty I am. God will take care of it. Whatever, man. I'm just a dude. That's not how the flowers are. A little Big Lebowski shout out. You're welcome. I don't know if that's allowed or not. Sorry. They're not just. The Old Testament talks about this word in Proverbs called the sluggard, which that is such a great word. Sluggard. Just everybody say that. Sluggard. I'm just a sluggard, man. So that's a really lazy person. And God talks against that all the time. Like I think there's one verse in Proverbs like a door on its hinges. So it's a sluggard kind of in his snoozing, basically, like just rolling around. I think I should get up. Nah. It's fine, I don't need to study. Okay, He is not opposed. He's not opposed to effort. So just, keep that in mind, all right, as we go on for that. You shouldn't be worried about whether God will take care of you or worried about whether, you'll mature spiritually, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't work for it. God's never opposed to effort. He's just opposed to earning. But he's not opposed to effort. So bear that in mind. Okay, and then just the last point, as we kind of think about this, this I think is a struggle for me still. So I can don't worry, okay, worry's, self-focus, it's not productive, I've got that. God cares for me, okay, he gave his life for me, he puts it, I'm worth something to him. Therefore, I'm worth something, period. I should trust that he will provide for me. That's great. But what about those times in our life where it seems like there's no provision? And this was tough for me. And this ties back a little bit to my anxiety and my worries, because those of you who know me pretty well, you know this. If you don't, I'll tell you that when I was young, my father passed away from cancer when I was 8 years old. He was a preacher. He was a good man, all that stuff. He, took care of the family to the best of his ability. And when he was diagnosed, there was a lot of prayer in our family, a lot of prayer in our congregation, in the community and extended family that, God would not take my dad away from me. And for those of you who have a good relationship with your dad, which I know isn't all of us, then that seems like something you probably needed. It seems like something I think I needed a dad around, but that was taken from me. So what do you do about that? And so I think that was connected a lot, even with my childhood fears, because I would pray that, God, don't let a tornado, take our whole house away and kill my family. Don't let a burglar break into the house and, rob us and go crazy. But I knew that you could pray for things that God wouldn't allow happen, and he would allow them to happen anyways. So that became a real struggle for me. But I think, and some of you may connect with that too. I see that some of you do. But I think that really ties in with this last point, kind of going into, I'm just going to start at verse 31 if you want to follow along. And basically he says, therefore don't worry and say, what are we going to eat? Or what are we going to drink? Or what are we going to wear? Or what are we going to get on our tests? Or who am I going to marry? Or who's going to take care of my family? Gentiles long after all these things. The non-religious peoples of the world. Your Heavenly Father knows that you need them. He knows what you need. Instead, desire first and foremost God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. I'll just finish it too. Therefore, stop worrying about tomorrow, because tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. It's a really, really cool statement too. But anyways, he says instead, desire first and foremost God's kingdom and God's righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. there's a pattern in Scripture, and especially, well, specifically in the New Testament, when it talks about kind of how this transformation of the believer takes place, how our character gets shaped more like Jesus. And you can kind of look through this, and actually, this is the very first time I ever heard this was a message taught by David Dutton, our very own David Dutton here. But there's this pattern of kind of, it goes like this. Don't stop doing this thing, have this transformation, and then start doing this thing. And sometimes it's referred to like a piece of clothing. Take this off, be renewed, and then put this new thing on. And this passage kind of follows the same way. It's like, stop worrying. That's silly. Stop it. Instead, be transformed by this truth that God really cares about you, values you, you can trust in Him. And especially in context of the gospel, I think that's a really transformative truth. And instead of seeking after all these things you have no control over, seek after first God's kingdom and His righteousness. So this is the thing we're going to put on. And so I think a really cool thing about this, and if you're unfamiliar with the concept of the kingdom of heaven, we did talk about it recently at Advance. By we, I mean me. It's basically an idea that, it's where God's will is done. It's the things that God desires. We talked about as being a lot of things, but a couple things for your life it looks like is loving God with your whole everything and loving the people around you. It's about going on God's mission with Him to seek and save the lost. These are the things He's about bringing justice to unjust situations. All this kind of thing, I think, goes into His kingdom. He tells us to seek this first. And I think the really cool thing, and so this is point 4, is adopt a kingdom perspective. Adopt a kingdom perspective. The really sweet thing about this perspective is that it changes our focus, first of all, from inward to outward. Worry, where it's inherently self-focused. When we seek after the kingdom, we're not so much worried about us. Our agenda matches up with His agenda, and we're focused on Him, and we're focused on other people. How we can meet and serve and love people, and how we can worship God with our whole lives, with our whole everything. And also, and this is the part that I think kind of connects to those deep-seated worries I had, is that His agenda, this kingdom, when we have this kingdom perspective, it's a very redemptive perspective. It's bigger. It's redemptive and it's bigger. And that our agenda, where it used to be just about us and our needs, can I get food on my table? Can I get into this master's program that I want to get into? Now our agenda is about the things of God and what He's doing in the world. And when we adopt that big story of redemption where God's coming after all people and He's trying to redeem the whole world back to Him through Jesus, through His death and His resurrection, when our perspective is there, then the things that seemed like they weren't provision have a different tune to them. So if my life and what I'm focused on is all about me and all about my agenda, then God took my dad away. He didn't provide. He doesn't love me. That's it. Because my life, I need these things. But if my agenda is focused on His kingdom, on what He's going to bring, on what He's doing, on people coming to know Him, then I can look back on my life, and has it been really hard because of that? Yeah, it's still hard. It's not like something you get over it like in a few weeks. It affects you for your whole life. You guys have experienced things just like this, I know. But I can look back and see how God has used that situation in my life and the lives of hundreds of people to bring about His will, His purposes. I wouldn't be here with you today if my life had gone differently. And I love what God's doing with my life right now. I'm a screw-up, I'm a mess, I'm a joke, but He's really been using me too, And my life wouldn't look like this if things wouldn't happen that way. So He does provide, but if you are focusing on a big perspective, on a kingdom redemptive perspective, then it's easy to see God is going to really provide for you. And you know what, my dad, he's doing just fine, too. So I wouldn't say God didn't provide for him either. But I think that's why the perspective is important. So I'm going to leave you with 3 questions, okay? 3 questions. We do this all the time. We leave you with questions, and then if you're like me, you don't write them down and never think about them ever again. Great, hooray, church, yay! Okay, but write them down, people. All right, you don't have paper? You have a smartphone? I know you do. All right, get it out, type them out. Whatever you got to do, all right? I'm not going to judge you too hard if you're not writing. But what I'd encourage you to do is think about these questions and talk to somebody about them. And especially if you're around here, you're a little bit more like you've been here for a while, you're a little older, you're a little bit more comfortable seeing people out, then you know who the people who aren't all that comfortable with it are, so maybe talk to them, seek them out. Okay? Go to lunch with us and talk about these things. This has to be more than just someone communicating a message and everyone leaving. Sorry, I got a little soapbox on that. You can probably tell between the prayer and the thing, but here we are, okay? These are the 3 questions I want you to think about. 1, what is worrying you right now? What's worrying you right now? And you can jot these down in your prayer cards as well if you want, but I really would like you to talk to somebody about these. I will too. I won't be a hypocrite. Just know if you sit by me at lunch, you know what's coming. What's worrying you right now? Number 2, how worthy do you believe yourself to be? How worthy do you believe yourself to be? Worth dying for? Remembering there's a difference between worthy and deserving. And 3, what are you putting your trust into? Really. No Sunday school answers. What are you putting your trust into? What's worrying you right now? How worthy do you believe yourself to be? What are you putting your trust into? Great. Okay, so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to pray for us. We're going to sing some songs. There'll be announcements. We'll probably do dinner. Lunch, I guess, whatever. Maybe sled. But take some time to speak through these questions with somebody, even if it's not today, but don't use it as an excuse to procrastinate. Remember, God's not opposed to effort. Put in some effort about you. All right. Okay, I'm going to pray. Lord, thank you so much for this community, God. Thank you for providing for us. And the unbelievable truth that's even for just 100 times extrovert for myself, it's hard to put words around, that you really, just really love us, God, more than we can know. And I thank you that's just something we can anchor into, God. And I pray that our view of ourselves and our view of one another in this body and our view of the people outside, even the people who are adamantly against you, God, would be shaped by the fact that you really, really, really love us. Help us to think that first about people, God. And I just pray that this community would be a community that is known for the value that it puts in other people. God, thank you for going to the cross and back for us. And I thank you that you are trustworthy, God. That we can put our full trust, our full faith in you, and never, ever, ever be let down. Be with us this morning, God, as church is not over. Be with us, God, as we continue to be the church throughout this week. In Jesus' name.